Okay, so this is set up a bit, and the colors are pretty close. Exactly, not perfect, but what's perfect? So I'm going to clean up some edges. I've dampened the brushes. I didn't disturb the paint on the palette, so I can get back to these colors, or pretty close to these colors. I think I showed you how to, if you're trying to get a really clean straight edge, which may or may not be something you're trying to do, you can just use one of your brush handles as a straight edge. Kind of run the brush down the angle of that. It's good to do like a practice run, just with a dry brush, just to see, and that can clean up edges a little bit. It's not quite the right color. Closer, but still not quite right. Okay, so I'm just gonna head down, and again, trying to make it perfect is not only kind of heartbreakingly difficult, it's rarely worth the energy. So don't stress about it. Make it the best you can, and the best you can is certainly good enough. So I'm going to clean this, since there's a little bit of gray in it. Those tones are going to make it difficult to achieve the color I want. So the reason for cleaning the whole palette last time was to get rid of the tones that were in the way. There were some pretty neutral colors, but it'll keep you from being able to achieve the intense colors you want. And as you're finishing the painting, you do want some intense color here and there. Okay. Just rebuilding that color string. Generally, I treat that as pretty sacred. Certainly with oils, I don't mess with that at all. I use a knife and lift out of that. But with acrylics, they dry so fast that you can't save the paint for very long anyway. So you may as well just paint and clean it up as you need to. I still try to keep it pretty neat. Certainly not interested in polluting the colors that I'm not using at the moment. I'm going to need them later. Okay, it's not quite there yet, but pretty close. So let's work on the greens. So once you've got this color going, so now I've got that color of the light, right? So we've agreed that there's this kind of slightly orange yellow note that runs through the light. So I don't pollute anything, I'm going to lift that, put it over there. Because it's the hue, it's not just the value, it's the temperature of the light. So as I move toward green, what I need is the color of the light. So if I throw white into it, I'm not actually looking at the light, I'm looking at the value. I want to see the color clearly. I want to see that orange, where that orange meets the green, somewhere in there. Okay, and there are a couple of different things going on. So let's take a look at this. It's not quite orange enough. That color lives somewhere in here. So there's a bit of that over here and up here, but it's almost one of the transition colors on this top edge. So there's a shape, the top of the teapot runs like that. Okay, and we talked about using glazes. So this glaze idea is that, Okay, I'm going to paint into that. The glaze idea is that I mix up an intentionally transparent color because it's another way of creating edges. See how thin the paint is? So as I drag that color across a form, it's just so weak between either, because it's a transparent pigment, which is the case with almost all of these pigments, either because it's a transparent pigment or because it has been neutralized a bit or made transparent by adding medium. Glazes are achieved both ways. So okay, so there's a little bit more green. It's a green with, I think it's closer. Okay, yep, something like that. And then it's softened, so I can soften it by painting into it with using the glaze, or I can drag it across the surface, which we talked about, like a dry brush. So there are a lot of ways to soften that color. Kind of like that. Okay, and then there's more of that orange quality, slightly neutralized on the underside on this surface because there's more of that tablecloth bouncing up into it. So it's a little closer to that. And I'm less interested in a kind of a perfect edge. I think that would be, I don't know, just doesn't seem like it's worth the effort. I also don't think they're as interesting. I think sometimes having broken edges and lost edges, they are just, they look nice. So I'm not going to try to fix everything about that. And as you want the green neutralized, remember crosswheel mixing, which is how we got this color in the first place. Once we got that color by crosswheel mixing, we brought some red into it. And that's, and it makes much more interesting colors than if you try to mix it with just with gray or with white or black. It's one of the reasons why, as shading goes, the most interesting way to get to the shading is by adding the complement. And some of those colors that seem like they'd be really hard to mix are really easy to make if you're looking at the complement, and really only difficult if you've already decided how you're going to make the color. Might be hard. But if you're open to the idea that colors kind of, there may be a weird way to get there. So grabbing red in order to mix a green may seem like a weird move, and I get that. But it's the other reason why color strings are so important, like mixing between those colors. Somewhere along that line is the move that I want. And these colors are so much more interesting as a result, and interesting is still the point. Okay, so that's more interesting. Okay, then this area through here.
To that as well.
I know that vases have a waist. Not really up on vase terminology. Oh, my studio assistant is coming to visit. I hear Baron. I think he's making monkey noises. Okay, we're going to pause the video. Okay. So important to keep your tools clean. No point in having an amazing clean palette if you have dirty brushes. So a good idea is to have 2 containers with water. One that you can rinse the brush out quickly, and one that has clean water so that you can make sure that it so the brushes are really clean, right? They need to be super clean. You don't want to spray your painting like I just did. That's generally a bad idea. When you run the brush across next time, you can lift color. So I'm not going to paint anything on this side, which was actually my plan. Instead, I'm going to see if I can work around this. I've got a few things over here on the cool side, and a few of these areas on the cool side. Now that I've made these adjustments on the warm side, there are a few things on the cool side I think I could touch up or improve a little bit. So I'll see if I can do that without messing up the painting. So a really important idea that we've talked about, okay, is that when you're looking at neutral colors, that they live on the opposite side of the color wheel, right? That they're somewhere between the colors. So if you're looking at something like a green and red, that they're related. That green and red have a very specific relationship. Red is like the anti-green, not like your anti-Griselda, but like the anti-green. It is the antidote for green. So if something is too green, you can bring red in and fix that too greenness about the painting. I like the way that dry brushing feels like light. So I use more dry brushing in the light than I do in the shadows. And part of the reason is it also heightens the texture. So all the work that I did to create an interesting painting up to this point pays off by having a little bit of texture that I can dry brush over, so that it's not quite as boring of a surface. And especially with acrylics, because the colors are just so easily, well, they just dry. They dry so dull, right? So being able to dry brush into something just a little bit, not a ton, but just being able to dry brush into it a tiny bit and make subtle changes, I think is really an important thing. In oil paints, I drag other tools into it. So I don't know if you can tell, but as that dries, and it dries quickly, right? It's a dry brush, so it dries pretty fast. But as that's going on, the surface is just a little more interesting now. It's not an answer to everything, but it's better than not doing something in there. And being able to dry brush just a little, being able to drag a little bit of light in, dry brush a little of that, and gives me one more tool, one more way to achieve something. So I can paint something pretty sharp, come up to an edge, really push on it, and knowing the paint is going to get more subtle anyway, because it's acrylics, and acrylics will do that. So I can bring something up a little bit or knock it down a little bit. And some of that subtlety is part of the stuff that people don't like about acrylics, is because it's so difficult to make it subtle and interesting. And then you see what you can do with just a really light dry brush, just a very, very light touch, that in these last couple of marks, that you can soften edges, really make something interesting or strange, or both. Okay, and so I'm not suggesting that dry brush is, I mean, they're like, nothing's a wonder tool that's going to fix everything. That just doesn't exist. But dry brush has some usefulness in being able to make interesting, subtle marks, hard and soft edges, that can make it feel much more thoughtful, much more thought out, right? And my knowing that I had that tool to go to kind of in my hip pocket, like knowing that I could use that, and as subtle as it is, you can be pretty bold. So I can, if I'm going to use a really subtle process, I can use bold colors. And if I'm going to use really bold colors, then I want to know that I've got a subtle process like this.
So I hope that kind of makes sense.
Let's see if there's anything else over here. Okay, so there's a bit of this color. So knowing that I can bring some of that in. Okay, and then there's a kind of a cool thing that goes on where this blue-gray needs the label over here. So because it's blue being added to the orange, it turns gray, which we looked at. So that's not a big surprise. It's not the cool part. But being able to lay that down very subtly so it feels a little bit more like light, and so it lines up with some of the other light things that are going on over there, can feel nice. And knowing it's going to become more transparent also helps. And then some of what's going on down in here is that orange. So part of it's the occlusion, part of it's the orange casting light into the shadow. So a lot of little things that are done right at the end can make a big difference. That same color, or I guess a slightly more subtle version of it, is on the other side of the bottle, right about in there. Let's see. Okay, I think that the other shapes are set up enough. I can go back to them, because we addressed, or started to address, some of what's going on in the body before I decided to atomize water across the surface and try to wreck that. Good call. But I hadn't carried that same process over here. And sometimes the move that it needs is unexpected. Which part of it, what makes it cool. It's fun to surprise yourself. When I was looking at that earlier, I hadn't really thought through what was missing there, but it was something of that orange light, the way it interacted, and the colors around the highlights. So in order to be able to paint those highlights in just a minute from now, whenever this dries, I've got to set those colors up. And just like you can bury a line, right? We talked earlier about buried lines. You can also bury edges, so you can mix up a color. So one of the good reasons to be clear on your color mixing is to be able to get back to a color, not too much stress. If you see that you want to fix something, so knowing that I want to come back and hit that edge, and I want to be able to kind of sneak up on the color. I don't want to lunge into something that's too far off. And I wanted to kill that purple a tiny bit anyway. Okay, I don't like how that lines right up with the edge. So some really big moves can be kind of offset with some small moves, and turning something from like a purple to a green shadow can take just a single mark. Can do that pretty easily, which can help to get rid of some of these little light areas that were down there and kind of distracting. And I can push that down as deep as so like, so I can move down toward darker colors. And there's also a dark edge through there and there, under there, and under there. Okay, so kind of in preparation for the highlights, I want to make sure that the dark values are all in place. So without the core shadows, occlusions, without all of those forms sort of nailed down, the light doesn't make any sense until the shadows make sense. And that's why I paint the light last. And I'm trying not to overuse any one color. There's no one color that's going to fix all my problems in life. But there are moves. Okay, let's see. Green, okay, and there was just a little bit of this. That edge was a little just driving me nuts. Again, in preparation for highlights. Okay, so I think I'm ready for highlights on here. I think that I could also dull down part of the apple. Should be cool over here. So it's still lighter than it was. But cool. Okay, all right, I'm almost done. Now it's just light on here. That's just setting up, and then highlights on cool and warm highlights. So I'm gonna mist the palette, let the paint set up so I don't accidentally activate paint underneath. Okay, I'm still puttering away with this little odds and ends. The light that's on the top of this is reflecting on the side of this pot. So I want to bring that up a bit, just because reflections are cool, but it's very green, right? It's reflecting on a green object. I went to edit the first one of these, try to put this together, and there's a great deal of my hat showing in this. I apologize. That's certainly not the plan. What are you going to do? Reflected light only shows up, or certainly dominantly shows up, in the shadows. So it's one of the reasons why the shadows are so cool. Literally they are cool, but also why they are so interesting is because you get such strange, colorful, odd things going on in the shadows. All of this stuff is going on in the shadows. It's not going on over in the light. The light is kind of simple. Right? Light falls on something, describes the form. That's the thing. The light, even the highlights that are on the shadow side. So I'm going to try to describe those. They're going to take on a little of the color of whatever the object is that they're reflecting from. It's just kind of a rule. And until there's something lighter, they can look pretty dramatic, right? I mean, that looks pretty dramatic. But then when you bring in something that is lighter and brighter, like when you get the incident light, so this is reflected off of the skylights. And you've seen me, hit this 3 or 4 times, and the paint just keeps kind of settling down to be something much more subtle, regardless of how boldly I apply it. And it's partly because acrylics are just like that. I mean, they just kind of dull down a bit. So, I mean, the tendency to over amp with them, I totally understand, particularly if you're trying to get there to meet a class deadline or something like that. But the work benefits from a little bit of patience and kind of sneaking up on the colors. Some of the stuff that you get to when you do that is different and worth it. Got the studio door open and it's a little bit late. Like you, I'm pushing the hours here. And of course, this demo is going to get to you. You know, tomorrow I'll start on a demo for the next project. This, because I wasn't feeling really well this week. This demo is getting to you after you need it. So it's not going to be specifically about this project. But I don't think that's the point. I'm not sure how I feel about that. It's not in the visual. But I felt like I needed to turn just a little bit. Okay, and the temptation to mess up all my paint. Boy, do I enjoy doing that. It's just great. So one of the things you can do when you have the temptation to drag phthalo blue into your white, which is really, seriously, not a good idea. Steal a little bit of this and move it over near the phthalo blue. So now the phthalo blue has its own pet white to mess up, and it's certainly going to do that. Okay. Okay, so we know that somewhere in a color string, yeah, what can go wrong here? I've got dirty water and paint on opposite sides, and the dribble path is my painting. This is okay. So the path I'm interested in, somewhere along this path between blue, although I want a cool blue. Okay, a cool blue, somewhere between on a path between a cool blue, that orange, somewhere in there. I'm going to make a tint of something. It's got just a little bit of orange in it.
More orange.
Something along there. I don't know. All right, worth a try. Some value, roughly. Yeah, we're definitely getting bugs in here. Haven't had to buy a bug zapper for the studio yet. Might have to. Otherwise it gets pretty hot and icky in here. I guess I should let that dry, give it another shot, see what's up. Okay, where those two colors, I told you that where two colors of light come together, they mix and they actually get brighter. That would be right through there. That's kind of what I was looking at in the photograph, was what kind of cool stuff was going on in that area. All right, let's see what else needs to happen. Oh, the orange needs to get brighter. I've once again made a mess of the center of the palette. It's just hard not to make a mess. It's so much fun. My studio assistant was over. That's why this demo didn't get finished. I got to babysit. And he is 3. and has a total disregard for deadlines. It's shocking. I tried to explain to him. But we share a real passion for Sean the sheep. So, you know, when you find a connoisseur, you gotta stick together. Okay, so just for grins, I don't like working flat like this. I like working on an easel. I have spent very little time in my life trying to work flat. This makes me very nervous. Lots and lots of ways I can mess this up. Plus, it's just really hard to see. But I haven't figured out yet how to set it up so you guys can watch me paint when the camera wants to be where my head is. It's hard enough on the tabletop, but it's almost impossible with an easel. I just move around too much. So I just haven't got that worked out. But for grins, let's look at where the light would be and how the light would be on the orange. I haven't managed to pollute all of that yellow yet. There's just no end to my bad habits, huh? Okay, so I'm interested in a tint of orange. A little yellow in it. And that highlight would be somewhere about in there. Yeah, about in there. And the highlight in this is going to be about in there.
There. There. There. There.
Okay, so let's kind of see what I've got to do to get there. You see how tossing that in there suddenly makes everything else look really subtle. You throw a big highlight in the middle of something.
Okay.
And it's a continuum, so it's somewhere on a color string. It's not one color or another, and I'm trying really hard not to make up little puddles of color. I might let that set up just because you can see it keeps returning to transparent, which is a little bit maddening. Okay, and go over and work on the green highlights for a minute. They have that same orangey pink light in them.
Right.
Okay. I guess we'll see how transparent that gets. That's always the thing. I mean, you can see them kind of fading right in front of our eyes. this late in the painting. I'd like not to spatter it with too much paint or water.
Okay.
This is so hard to see. Okay, so finding those in-between colors so that you can turn the form. So paint the highlight and then find those in-between colors somewhere between the highlight. So if the highlight, in this case, right, it's not a sparkly reflection, not a sparkly white reflection. It's the center light. And then figuring out those colors between the center light and the half light. Knowing that they're going to get a little bit more transparent, so I can overamp this just a little bit. Okay, and then I can drag and see how that when that comes, when that hits really hard like that, then this becomes super subtle. And a second ago, this looked really dominant, looked really intense. And now, since those green highlights have settled down a bit, and take this peachy light, which is the color of the light, and lay that in there, leaving that kind of green glow around it, just a little bit of that green glow. So that, right, because the light is hitting that green, kind of, I'm not sure what the word is, but it's, I'll talk to John. I'm sure there's a photographic term. Photographers are so much smarter than painters. Okay, so it's getting there, right? You can see it's moving in the right direction. Make this just a tiny bit brighter, lighter value. Try not to bring any green into it. Where it's falling, since it's falling on an orange, that last little bit of highlight. Kind of drag that over the surface. And then highlights are interesting because they depend on the size of the highlight. So this larger highlight, because it's larger, should be a little bit brighter than the other highlights. Okay, I'm sure there are 20 other things I should take care of, but I really want to get this in for you. At least as an example. Okay, so yeah, all right. So see that in light? That doesn't suck. Okay, so so in acrylics, I tried to use all of the different processes I've shown you. They're dry brushing, wet on wet, working into a medium, right? So I did several places where I did the blend by putting down clear paint or clear medium and then blending the paint into that medium. I think I used all of the processes that we talked about. Wet on wet. Gradated colors. So I'll use that a lot. It's probably the dominant thing I do is just mix a new color and put one color, another color, another color, another color, and allow your eye to turn that. That's just everywhere. That halo around there, all through this, just mix up a separate color. So there wasn't wet on wet mixing or dry brushing. It was just mixing up a new color. The sequence of little marks here, allowing your eye to do the work. So that's kind of where it is. I could mess with this, but honestly, I just mess it up. So let's call it, and let me get this online for y'all. Okay.